Hey everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop. This time we're going to be installing a carbide tip segmented spiral cutter head thingy in my planer. So if you're not familiar with this style of cutter head, I actually have one on my jointer. It uses indexable carbide inserts instead of straight knives to provide the actual cutting. The fact that they're carbide means that they last a long time, and because they're segmented, it means that every single little tiny cutter can be treated individually. So if one gets dull or gets dinged or gets damaged, you can easily rotate that cutter head because it does have 4 sides on it to a fresh surface. And the fact that there's a cutting edge on all 4 sides means that once you dull the first side, you still have 3 rotations left to get 3 times the life out of those inserts before you have to replace them all. The other nice thing here is that because, like I said, they're carbide, they last a ridiculously long time. The inserts on my jointer lasted, I rotated them for the first time after 7 years. So one of these cutter heads will last you a very long time, especially if you're more of a, I guess, in a hobbyist type shop like I am, where you're not running stuff through your planer constantly all the time. But if you are, you can save a lot of downtime because you're not going to be, changing inserts, setting knives nearly as often. Now, the downside to this is that it's a lot more expensive than the traditional straight knife cutters. So I've been kind of going back and forth on the decision to actually install one of these into this planer because these things last so long and they are a lot more money to actually buy and then the time to actually install them into your machine. That's been kind of the sticking point for me because I know this is not the last planer that I'm ever going to own. And I do want to get a bigger planer, and I'm not sure when it's going to be because I can't put a bigger planer in the shop. But someday when I move and I have more space, one of the things I'll do is get a bigger planer. So something like this, after I install it, I likely won't even get full use out of the first edge of inserts, which has been like kind of the more sticking point for me as far as the investment goes. However, one of the things that kind of interests me the most is a lot of the feedback that we get on Wood Talk, which is the podcast that I do with Mark Spagnuolo and Shannon Rogers, is the fact that these cutter heads actually demand more power from your motor, so you can't take as heavy as a cut. At least that's what people say. And I haven't really seen a whole lot of information about this as far as like actual real-world performance differences between straight knives and the spiral knives. So one of the kind of focusing points of this video is going to be to compare the amount of power required to actually make these cuts. So first, let's talk about cost. So the straight knives in my planer right now would usually last me about 8 months or so. Just kind of depends on how much stuff I'm running through there in a given time period. But about 8 months seem to be about average. And every time I had them sharpened, they would cost about $50. So this place actually closed, which is one of the things that kind of prompted me to do this. But this is where I was taking my knives to be sharpened. So let's just say that in the years that I've owned this planer, I've had the knife sharpened maybe 5 times or so. So I've spent about $250 sharpening knives for this planer. Now, on the flip side of things, this cutter head was about $1,000. And then on top of that cost was also the additional cost of the bearings. I went with some decent ones, so these were additional, like I think $50 for bearings or somewhere around there. So a little over $1,000 for all the parts for this upgrade. Now it's with a 20-inch cutter head. Of course, that cost is going to vary depending on what size you buy. But for 20-inch, $1,000 on top of whatever you pay for this planer is kind of funny because this I bought used. And I paid $800 cash, and I gave the guy 100 board feet of walnut, so it had a rough value of $1,200. So this cutter head cost me almost as much as I paid for this planer. So before we jump into it, as a bit of an aside, I do want to just share a little bit about bearing sizing. So the last time I did a video where I placed bearings, which was on my old rigid table saw, I didn't really know anything about sizing bearings or how simple that whole system is. And I'm sure a lot of people don't either because I still got questions on that video about where to find those replacement bearings because it's not available from the replacement parts company. And it's actually pretty simple. So bearings have a simple universal system for identifying the type and size of bearing. And if I take a look at the ones for the planer, what I'm concerned with first here is those first 4 numbers. And those first 4 numbers are actually broken up into 3 identifying features. So the first number there is going to be a 6. And then it's going to be a 2, and then the last 2 digits are one thing, so that's 06. So the first number is going to be the type of bearing, And for most of the things you're going to find in your woodworking equipment, it's going to be a 6. That is a ball bearing, or more specifically, a single row deep groove ball bearing. So just for the sake of this is a ball bearing, and that is going to be a metric. If it is an imperial one, it'll start with an R. The second number is going to be the duty rating of the bearing, and that goes from 0 to 4, 0 being the lightest duty and 4 being the heaviest duty. So in my case, this 2 is sort of a medium duty. And the last number is going to be the bore size, so the hole there in the center. Now for a single digit, that just translates directly to a millimeter equivalent, but for 2 digits, it gets a little more, let's say, interesting. So for 00 through 03, that's going to be 10, 12, 15, and 17 millimeter. Once you get above 04, you just take this number, multiply it by 5, and that'll give you the millimeter bore size. So this is going to be 6 times 5, which is going to be 30 millimeters. So the next thing you'll see on these bearings is some letters and numbers. And in this case, this is a 2RS. RS stands for rubber seal, and 2 stands for 2 seals. So it has an inner seal and an outer seal. So this bearing is going to be really well sealed against dust and fine particulates like that. And it's also a shielded bearing, and the shielded bearing will just have a steel kind of shield on the outside here instead of the rubber that fully seals it. The shield just prevents larger stuff from getting into the bearing. And then you could also get a totally unsealed one that you could then lubricate yourself. These fully sealed bearings are typically going to be permanently lubricated, so you don't have to worry about lubricating them ever. And on my bearing, there's also a C2. That is just the internal clearance for the balls. Unless you're doing something crazy, you don't really need to worry about that too much. A standard clearance is all you're really going to need. So just for comparison's sake, that is the bearing for the guides on my bandsaw. So that's a 608 RS. So it's a ball bearing. It's a 0, so it's a very light duty bearing. And it's an 8, so it's an 8 millimeter bore through the center there. It's also single sealed, so it just has an RS. It doesn't have a 2. And that's really all to say that if you have the bearing in your hand, you can see the number on there. You can order your bearings from any supplier, and they'll be the right ones for your machine. So these are going to be press fit, so they need to be either installed into the shaft with an actual press or tapped on with a hammer. One of the little tricks you can do with installing bearings is take advantage of thermal expansion and contraction. So if you raise the temperature of the bearing, the bore size is going to increase a little bit because the metal will expand. And the opposite is true for the shaft. If you cool the shaft, it'll contract and lose a little bit of diameter. So I picked a pretty good day for this. It is currently like -20 something outside Fahrenheit. And the Cutterhead has been outside for a couple of days now, so it should be down to that cold temperature. So room temperature bearing 75 degrees Fahrenheit. The Cutterhead should be down to -25 or so. So we have a 100-degree difference between the steel in the bearings and the steel on the Cutterhead. So that should reduce the size by about half a thou. And I think the interference fit on these things is about 1 thou or something like that. So these things should go on a lot easier than if they were both at room temperature. But let me go grab that Cutterhead. It is going to be pretty cold. So when this thing goes on, you want to only be striking on the inside race of the bearing. So I have this plastic sleeve which fits over there, which should allow me to just hammer this thing on without actually touching the bearing area or anywhere else except the inner race. Ah, it's cold. That is very cold. Note to self, do not touch Cutterhead. There you go, that's fully seated now. Man, that Cutterhead is freezing. And this is the moment where I realized that the Cutterhead actually takes 2 different size bearings. So I will order the correct size and we'll get back to this in a few days. Before we get started, I do want to take a baseline reading with this planer. So I'm going to plane a piece of cherry, which isn't super hard, but it's a typical wood for the type of stuff that I do. So I'll run through and just kind of touch off until I get just a light cut, and then I'll take a typical roughing cut, which I normally would. So I'll take a 3/16 of an inch cut for the actual test. I'll have the dust collection off so we can hear the load on the motor. I have an amp meter, which I have clamped around the cord so we can measure the actual electrical draw of the motor and kind of see how much load is under that way. I also have a decibel meter so we can get an idea of how loud it is. The spiral heads do run quieter, so that's kind of a proven fact, but just for some more interesting data, I have that as well. And I also think it's worth noting that these blades are beyond dull at this point. So with that baseline established, let's tear into this thing. So I pulled the drain plug on the gearbox before dinner time, and it's like, I don't know, a few hours later, I got the kids put to bed, so now I'm back at it again. Getting to this point was about 20 minutes. This goes pretty quickly, at least so far it is. We'll see if that continues. So I'm getting ready to drop the cutter head and gearbox out as one unit. I have a few pieces of wood there, or 2 pieces of wood on the bed to support the cutter head as it drops out. So once I remove these bolts holding the gearbox on here, should be able to just tap the cutter head and the gearbox out of their respective housings. That's good. The gearbox is loose, so that means all I have to do is knock the bearing out of the bearing housing on the other end. All right, I'm going to remove this cover. Whew. All right, that was a lot of work. I think I'm gonna pop this chip thing off of here to give myself a little more room to work. So luckily for me, I didn't seat the bearing on the cutter head yet, because the way this thing goes together is the bearing has to come in from one side and the cutter head comes in from the other side. So if this is mounted on the cutter head already, there's no way to get the whole thing installed. So they need to be installed as 2 separate pieces, pinning the gearbox in the middle. The bearing in here is actually still really good. I think I'm just going to leave it in there. It has a seal on the back, so I don't have to worry about disturbing any of that. So I'm just going to go ahead and start putting it all back together. Hopefully this should go a little bit more smoothly. This gearbox is a little more, honestly, it's a little more complicated than the examples that I've seen already. As I kind of went into this, the gearbox kind of comes apart in sort of a weird way. So that was a little bit of a surprise for me. But other than that, though, as long as I put it back how I found it, it should be fine. Since this flange pushes against the inner race of that bearing, it should pull the whole thing together while I tighten down the screw which attaches it to the shaft. That thing is heavy. All right, so this is definitely one of those I hope this works moments. So let's plug this thing in, see if it spins without exploding. Here we go. Well, that's oddly quiet. Is it spinning? Yeah. Okay. That's kind of scary. It's almost too quiet. It sounds like it's not working, but it is. Feed rollers are still turning. That's good. Yeah, seems to be working. So now I can repeat the test again to see what kind of change we have. So again, I run the board through until I find the cut, and then I can increase the cut depth to 3/16 of an inch, and we'll see how things look. Again, I'll have the dust collector running as I'm finding the cut, and then when we make the actual test cut, I'll turn that thing off so the sound from the dust collector isn't interfering with our results. Not so much. So just for fun, let's see how this thing does with the 1/8 inch depth of cut. Since I'm really only worried about the motor draw at this point, I'm going to run the dust collector and we'll see how this goes. So I guess I won't be taking off as heavy of a cut as I'm used to, but I guess that's alright. I thought it was really interesting seeing the difference, especially with how dull these blades really are. So if we go back and look at a comparison of the cuts side by side with the board at the same position throughout the cuts, we can kind of see exactly the difference in the actual noise level as well as the draw of the motor. So the noise level before hovered around 104, and then afterwards was around 80, 85, 87, somewhere around there. So almost a 20 decibel drop in noise, which is absolutely ridiculous. And then as far as the amount of draw from the motor, with the straight knives, it was around 22 amps or so. And then with the new Cutterhead, it was around 29 before the belt started slipping and that draw went much higher. So I guess on that cut, I could have tightened the belts a little bit to really just pull some more power out of the motor, but I think that thing was getting so close to popping a breaker anyway that I think we really found the limits of that cut. This board is about 10 inches wide here in the middle, And I chose this board specifically because it does get wider as you get through here, so I thought that'd be kind of a interesting thing to see. And also, speaking of that, you can actually see in the video with the amp draw when the cutter head gets to the knot in here, which I thought was kind of cool to see as I was looking back at the playback. So real quick, let's take a look at cut quality. So this is the spiral head over here. Pretty darn near perfect. I don't really see any spots that tear out anywhere. The surface is really clean. The backside I planed with the straight knives before getting started here. I've got some tracks from the blades being nicked, but the cut quality overall, besides those nickings, besides those nicked track marks, the cut quality is really good. There's not a whole lot of tear out, so I think it's kind of interesting, especially on a straight grain stock like this. You're not going to see a whole lot of difference. You can see down here I do have a little bit of tear out from, I guess, out here where the grain direction was changing, but overall there isn't a whole lot of like big chunks missing and stuff like that. So actually not a whole lot of difference in the straight grain cherry as far as cut quality goes between super dull knives and a spiral head. So let me pull one of these knives out here so we can take a look and see how dull it is. Yeah. You couldn't cut yourself on this if you tried. That is, yeah, dull. So lastly, is this upgrade worth it? And I think that's going to depend on your situation. For me at least, I'm really looking forward to having that thing in there so I don't have to worry about changing knives all the time. That should make it a little bit nicer, and I should have a little more consistent results when I'm using more figured woods. So things have a lot more wild grain than this really boring cherry here. I've had the spiral cutter head on my jointer for the 8 years that I've had that, and I can always be sure of the cut quality on that machine. On the planer, it's kind of, most of the time it's good, but sometimes you can kind of get a curveball where you get like this big tear out chunk for like no apparent reason. Now lastly, is this upgrade something that you want to attempt yourself? And that's really going to depend on your mechanical inclination. The process of getting this thing apart and that stuff is super easy. It's the parts where you get to the actual bearing and the cutter head that really slowed me down, at least. And that's really what happens with, I think, every little mechanical thing that I get myself into. The process seems really easy. You know, pull, I don't know, remove these bolts, pull these things off, and you're good to go. But if you ever like try to fix your car, for instance, you know that that process is like not even close to reality, because it's always like, oh, this bolt is stuck or this won't come out, etc., etc. So at least with this process, the actual stuff that does not involve the cutter head, it's like pulling off the sprockets and all the stuff over here, pulling off the pulley. That stuff is like maybe 20 minutes to pull it off, half hour to put it back on. So that's about 45 minutes to an hour there. This whole process took me about 4 hours. So between removing all these many parts and then this main assembly is where all the time went. Getting the bearings pulled off of here, getting this thing out of the housing was a huge pain. That gearbox was not fun to take apart and put back together. So that's where all the time went. It's not difficult, but you might drop some F-bombs along the way. So I think that's going to do it for this one. Thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments on the Cutterhead or anything here in my shop, please feel free to leave me a comment. As always, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.